Hello, boys and girls. My name is Latasha, and I will be reading you a story called The Baker's Dozen, a Colonial American Tale. It's retold by Heather Forrest and illustrated by Susan Gaber. Van Amsterdam was a baker of great renown. People traveled for miles to buy his goods in Albany Town. He baked breads and cakes and muffins of every conceivable kind. He even invented a pastry of his very own design. One day, just before the winter holidays, as Van Amsterdam was rolling out his cookie dough, he was inspired to cut out the shape of a jolly round man. Then he gave it two, two raisins for eyes, and a little walnut for a mouth. After baking the cookie character, he painted it with red and white icing so that it looked just like St. Nicholas. Here it is, right here. He proudly put the cookie in his shop window. A passerby, noticing it, came in to order several. Delighted, Van Amsterdam spent the rest of the day cutting and baking those tasty cookies. Before long, the St. Nicholas cookie had become famous. Look at all the people coming inquiring about that St. Nicholas cookie. Now, people came from even farther away to buy his St. Nicholas cookies in Abington. And of course, they bought his other goods as well. Van Amsterdam grew quite prosperous, and one night, as he was busy counting his money, a thought occurred to him. If I use just a little less butter, no one will know. If I use just one less egg, they will scarcely be able to tell. If I use just a little less honey, then there will be more money for me. And no one did notice when Van Amsterdam started to use just a little less of all the fine ingredients he had always used in his baking. No one noticed because Van Amsterdam was famous. People had stopped judging the quality of his goods, for his goods were famous too. One day, into his shop came an old woman wearing a long black shawl over her head. She said, Van Amsterdam, I have come to purchase 1 dozen of your famous St. Nicholas cookies. Very well, he said, taking a cloth bag. He filled it with 1 dozen of his finest cookies and handed it to the old woman. She took the bag from him, opened it, and then looked up, complaining. Van Amsterdam, you've cheated me. I asked for a dozen cookies, and look here, you've given me only 12. A dozen means 12, Van Amsterdam stated firmly. A dozen means 13, she insisted, and you're a greedy man. Van Amsterdam was a proud man who did not like to be judged harshly by anyone. I am a good and honest baker, he shouted. A dozen means 12, and not one more. How dare you call me greedy? Get out of my store. As the old woman swept out of his shop, she turned back and said, You'll be sorry, Van Amsterdam. The next morning, when Van Amsterdam took his loaves from the oven, he was shocked to discover that his bread tasted salty. His pies were sour. His cookies were so hard they couldn't be bitten. Everything he made turned out wrong. I don't understand, he said. Has it been so long since I used a proper measure that I have forgotten my recipes? Well, perhaps tomorrow will be better. For some reason, his recipes aren't coming out right. But it was no better. His breads rose so high he could not get them out of the oven. His cakes crumbled. Everything he baked tasted terrible. It wasn't long before people who came to his shop to buy his pies and cakes and cookies and muffins had to admit that even though Van Amsterdam's bakery was famous, the things he made there didn't taste good at all. So they stopped coming. And as people stopped coming, Van Amsterdam stopped baking. Oh, Van Amsterdam. His cooking just don't taste the same as it used to be. And he doesn't have to cook that much anymore because less and less people are coming to buy his goods. One day, near Christmas, he sat in his shop with nothing left to sell but a small pile of those famous St. Nicholas cookies. He'd eyed his empty shelves and wondered, why has my fortune gone from so good to so bad? Van Amsterdam began to cry. It may have been the tears in his eyes, but it seemed to Van Amsterdam that the mouth on one of the St. Nicholas cookies was moving. He heard a voice say, You'll never be rich because you're greedy. At that moment, there was a knock at the door, and into his shop came the old woman wearing the long black shawl. She said, Van Amsterdam, I've come back to purchase 1 dozen of your famous St. Nicholas cookies. Uh-oh. Wide-eyed and trembling, Van Amsterdam reached for a bag and opened it. Into the bag, he put 12 St. Nicholas cookies. He looked up at the old woman and then slowly put in one more. She took the bag from him with a grin. She opened it and carefully counted the cookies. "Thank you," she said. Well, word went through the towns that at Van Amsterdam shop, a dozen means 13. People started coming back to buy that baker's dozen. Van Amsterdam began baking again, and he put an extra measure into everything he made. Soon his shop prospered. He's back on top again. It's St. Nicholas' famous cookie. All the other bakers noticed how busy Van Amsterdam's shop had become, so they too began to give 13 in a dozen. The custom spread throughout the colonies, for merchants had discovered that when generosity replaces greed, good fortune follows. And soon, in many bakery stores, a dozen meant 12. And then one more. Arthur's note in 1655, when Albany, New York was still called Beverwick, there lived a colonel baker named Clark Jan Peterson, Van Amsterdam. This is the tale of how he came to give 13 in a dozen, inspiring an American custom that in some places persists even today. And this book was dedicated to the extra measure, which reminds me of an old saying: it's better to give than to receive. Sometimes you just got to give just a little bit more, go beyond what's expected. I like this read, and I hope you have really enjoyed it.